Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan, joined as always by my friend, the founder and CEO of startups.com, Will Schroeder. Will, look, as founders, we are no strangers to pressure, right? But so much of that pressure doesn't come from like what we actually want. It comes from the expectations that we take on from investors, peers, the startup community, okay, and to some degree ourselves. And we end up like chasing these goals that aren't even ours, comparing ourselves to other people, believing success will fix all the problems that it can't. So let's unpack that. But like, let's start with like, where does this come from? Why the hell are we doing this?
It's interesting because it comes from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Like
Sounds right.
I've spent so many years, personally unpacking where do my expectations come from. And a lot of people, when they talk about how their lives have gone, and a lot of people at different junctures in life kind of have that reflective moment. And I'm always fascinated when they say, like, it's almost always, I'm not as far ahead as I should be. And I always think to myself, are you sure? Right? Like, based on what exactly?
Yeah.
And I rarely get a good answer. And I think for founders, this is a big issue.
Yeah, man, I feel like the worst expectations we can possibly have, regardless, like if I don't know anything else about them, if you didn't question them, right?
Yeah.
Because it starts to push you into like chasing some version of success that maybe isn't even yours, right? Like we just got these things by proxy, inherited them from some posts we read on the internet without even really internalizing or whatever. And next thing you know, we're making decisions based on this. We're listening to advice based on
Whole
this.
lives.
We're to take action and do stuff without having question, like, do I even want to have these expectations myself or my startup?
It's unbelievable because I think in terms of like how much time and energy and devotion we're going to put into fulfilling these expectations.
Yeah.
And then I think about how little time we put in determining how they got here.
Yeah, right.
Why we had them to begin with, right?
Yeah. It's like you're just randomly completing instructions from an instruction booklet. And then you're like, where did this come from? Like, who gave me this booklet? Like, do I even want to build this thing that they're suggesting? And it happens so often. It's funny that like, I feel like part of it in my case was like, sometimes I was so confused about what I need to go and do. And I didn't recognize that was okay. That it was like, it was okay to not know what the answer was, that any answer was going to be better than that. And so if somebody was like, well, why I think you should go do this, I'd be like, okay, that's a good expectation. Like without really thinking about whether it had anything to do, it's like it was an expectation. So I could go execute against it without thinking about whether that actually fed into anything that I was trying to accomplish.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. We're not only spend all this time that I just mentioned a moment ago, but we're going to risk a lot of stuff. Everything from financial to emotional to our health to our relationships. And imagine risking all of that on the assumption that you had certain expectations, only to find out later that they were bullshit. Which, by the way, is usually the case. That's usually the outcome.
Yeah.
So what I thought would be cool is why don't we take and dissect all the different buckets that these expectations come from for founders and talk about how they got here, why we're responding to them in that way. And then if we're lucky, figure out how to ignore all of them. Let me ask you this. Which one comes to mind first? When you think of something that drives, obviously to founders, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, like it pretty clearly in our case, like all the founders we talk to, a lot of them are seeking funds. Not all of them, but a lot of them are seeking funds or considering whether they should. And so expectations from the investor base, right? This is a huge driver of people thinking they need to go do something because an investor has this expectation, an investor has that expectation, or I think an investor expects this, whether I've actually heard that from them or not. And oh, by the way, have they invested in your company? No. Yeah. Why are you running their playbook exactly? Well, I think that's what is expected of me. Shit, here we go.
I want to share a story of where I missed investor expectations at every possible level, but even to an extent that the investors were like, what are you doing? So I'll give you an example. Years ago, I'd gotten some venture funding for affordit.com, which doesn't exist anymore. It was basically what Affirm is now. It was an amazing group of investors. Like First Round Capital was in there. Dave McClure, when he had before he'd started 500 Startups, was in there. Mark Suster was in there. Bessemer was in there. I mean, there's a lot of folks in there. Mike Jones from what's now Science, did Dollar Shave Club, stuff like that. Awesome investors. I was so excited. Right. I was so excited and so humbled to I take that back. I was not humbled.
I don't remember this part of the story, Will.
I made up the humility part. That's not true. That's probably what got me into trouble. Anyway, I remember thinking like these guys have put in, a whole ton of money, some of them personally,
Yeah.
right? Like Mark Suster, who now runs Upfront Ventures. I don't think he was part of it yet, and he just put in personal money. Might have been one of the first investments he made. So I felt pretty like tethered
Yeah.
to this expectation, which is where it started coming off the rails because I was the only person that felt tethered. Now, when people put in money, they have expectations. I mean, literally, that's the deal, right? And have you seen any case where people put in money and they're like, yeah, I'm good?
Maybe in the case of like family investments,
Ah,
right?
good point.
It's like,
Good point.
yeah, but
Good point.
that's it. And I would even hazard a guess that even if they're saying like, yeah, don't worry about it, doesn't matter. Like that's not what they're thinking. Right? It might be what they're saying. But yeah, no, pretty much in every other case, there's going to be expectations. And why wouldn't there be? But there are expectations there. But the thing we got to remind ourselves is that those expectations aren't ours. They're not even really about us. They're about the investor, right? It's about their returns. It's about their timelines. It's about their portfolio and what
Yep.
needs to come out of that for them, right? Now, sure, some of that stuff aligns with what you want. It's not like they're thinking like, okay, we're just going to liquidate all his assets in his car and then we're going to sell it and that'll be how we get our money back. Yay. Right. It's not like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But very frequently, the drivers of the decisions, right? If they were to drive the decision, they may pick something very, very different. I mean, we talked about this last week. We're talking about investors wanting to push us off a cliff. It's not that they want to push us off a cliff. They just need us to move in specific ways that might be counter to what we want to
100%.
get what they want, right? So this is where that alignment with the expectations can become problematic.
But here's, I think, the part where we consistently, and folks listening to this now, I want you to lean a little closer on this one because this is one of the things I see missed most consistently. They believe that the investor wants this thing to succeed regardless of the expense of the founder. Now, I'm sure there's investors that are perfectly fine with that, right? But generally, that has not been my understanding, right? Or my experience. Let me fast forward through my story. So we were out of money. We were running right into the financial crisis and no one was writing checks. Sounds familiar. So we're running around long past the point where we're out of money and we've been written off. I think at that point I had done 80 investor pitches, which is I mean, that's not 80 emails. Those are actual meetings. Yeah, back when you had to meet with everybody, there was no Zoom yet. I get to the point where I'm so drawn out. I mean, it sucked the life out of me. It was miserable. And this is like a year and a half doing this nonstop. And at some point, I finally bring it to the investors, and I'm like, "Look, guys, honestly, this isn't going to happen. Like, I've done everything I possibly could. I have no idea what else to do. I've been killing myself because I feel so strongly about my commitment to you." And they looked at me and they're like, "Yeah, we wrote it off like a year and a half ago. Like, we haven't even thought about it."
But don't you expect me to? Aren't your expectations to? Hey, wait. But I've been doing all this shit because I thought you wanted me to. Yeah, this is the big danger, man, in letting anybody else's expectations drive your life because you might not have been clear on that. Like, well, you said this thing to me one time. Like, well, yeah, in passing, but I didn't mean that you need to go like live your life according to that. It wasn't a mantra. It was just like an observation. Right? Like, God.
Yeah, no. And so we get to this place where we build a narrative. And this happens over and over and over. And all the buckets we talk about, I'm sure there will be a consistent thread there. But we build this narrative. In that narrative, we're always the bad guy. Not the villain per se, but the person doing something wrong.
Yep.
Right. And we look at it as the investors, whatever their expectation, who it's from and what it is legitimate.
Yeah.
And it always blew my mind, right? We may not get to things like parents, et cetera, but I mean, that's a huge one. But like people say, this is what my parents expected of me. And I think to myself, who are they? And now I know that's heretical. Right? How can you dare say, who are my parents? They're just other adults and maybe not adults that could make really bad decisions. And you're basing your whole life on that. It's bananas.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like you got to go back and say like, like to your point, like what right do they have to have an expectation? And look, most in the case of parents, like let's assume most of them were well-intentioned at least, right?
Of course.
They had an expectation so that you could achieve something in life so that probably you could just get off their couch, right? And so that's fine. But even those you have to question, right? Like we know the whole thing about best intentions, right? Like paved the road to hell. Right. Same thing here. Like even if they're well intended, it does not mean that it's your path, right? The minute you are not defining your path, the minute someone else's expectations are defining your path, you're probably on the wrong path. So just constantly ask yourself, right? Am I doing this because I believe this is necessary, because I believe this is what gets me to where we want to be, because I believe this is the right thing to do right now, and that I
Right.
have reasonable expectations for what it will yield? Or is it some version of somebody else's idea, or something that I've amalgamated Mark Twain style, where I'm pulling from like 10 or 15 different characters and now I've rolled them into one, and this is the set of expectations that I have to live by? God, don't do this to yourself.
Let's take that. Let's expand upon that and project it again onto the investor pool. It's easy to overlook this because most of us, this is the only investment we'll ever do. 90% of investments will fail, just statistically. And when we look at that from our standpoint, from the founder standpoint, this is our only investment, so to speak, right? This is our only deal. So we don't have a portfolio theory here where we can say, oh, I guess so I'm just one of the ones that failed. No big deal.
Yeah.
Right. So we put it on ourselves that this one has to be the one.
Yep.
And by the way, no investor is going to pull you aside and say, ah, you're good. Don't worry about it. I got some other good deals. Do what you do.
Yeah.
Don't do what you do. I don't care. You'll never.
I
get
assume
that
you'll be
speech.
one of the 18 out of 20, not the 2 out of 20. So don't take it too hard on yourself now.
And so because we get so wrapped up in this idea that the expectation is that we are going to be the 1 in 20. And don't get me wrong. I mean, you shouldn't play this game if you don't expect to try to be the 1 in 20.
Correct.
But in the absence of understanding how this thing actually works, that is a place to drive you to insanity.
Absolutely.
I know this now, and I would never make the same bet again. I would never have that mentality, even though I'd want to win. Yeah. I would look at it going, we'll try to win, and I'll do everything I possibly can. But I know now that the expectation of the investor is that we'll probably lose.
Yeah. I think that's the real problem here, is you start imposing your own expectations. And again, those expectations are healthy for you to have. You have to assume you're going to win. Otherwise, why would you have gone and done this? Why would you spend your time doing this? Why would you ask other people for their money? So yes, you have to expect that you're going to succeed, but don't expect that everyone else expects the same thing. Right? The minute you start imposing your expectations on them, or you, and then you start to act accordingly, right? Where you're like, well, I assume that they want me to behave this way, so therefore I will. It's a really, really dangerous trap, and just an unnecessary one, right? They, again, to your point, they don't have that same expectation of you. So there's no need for you to foist that upon them and then pretend that you're doing it for their benefit or their good. They don't care. They're not thinking of it the same way you are.
What venture fund, I'll just use venture funded as an example, but what venture funded founder doesn't feel like their neck is in a noose because of the investor expectations? I hardly meet any. I don't meet any laissez-faire founders that are like, I took the money, it worked, didn't work. And to be fair, if that's the way you feel, you sort of shouldn't be in this game.
And then, I don't have another one. It was Adam Newman. That's it. That's the only I can think of.
So my thought is, the resolution, if you will, when you're thinking about where your expectations come as they relate to the investors, we've got to give it perspective. We've got to
100%.
say, yes, the investors would love to get an outcome, but the expectation is that there's a 10% chance that could happen.
Yep.
It's like basically, I'm a lottery ticket to them that might pay off. The expectation isn't that I'm a guarantee, I'm a certificate of deposit CD that's going to yield in 5 years exactly this rate, right? That's not what the expectation is. And frankly, if it is, the issue isn't you, the founder, it's the investor that doesn't understand how investments work.
Yeah. I mean, to the extent possible, right? Not always entirely possible to suss all this out. And maybe it isn't represented clearly on the term sheet or anything like that. But like, before you take on the money, ask yourself, like, what expectations am I actually agreeing to? And are they stated or not? And if they're not, then you're not agreeing to them. Okay. Make that clear. And how do those align with my goals? Right. Because again, like, investor expectations are their priorities, not yours. Build towards your goals. Let the outcomes be aligned, but the methodology doesn't have to be. Right. The way you go and do things and the expectations that get you there can be completely separated from the outcomes. And at the end of the day, the outcome is what everybody should be aligned on. And that should be a kind of a common goal, a common ground that we're working towards. Right.
Yeah, agreed. And so here's the way I think about it. Like, when we have, we do our founder groups where we bring a bunch of founders together and everybody kind of weighs in. Whenever I do a founder group that's a group of all funded founders, here's what I see immediately. I see all of them, when they give their updates, basically projecting their investor's voice. This is what but here's the second thing, which leads us to another bucket.
Ryan, are you just reading us replies to your latest investor update? Maybe.
Yeah, right. Probably, kind of. But what I'd consider to be a second bucket, using this as context, is that we'll go around the room and everybody will give their startup updates. And by way of that, in this case, investor updates. And immediately, every single founder there will start benchmarking off the other founder.
Yep.
Oh, you couldn't raise another round? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, shit, I couldn't raise another round either. Oh, like you're having trouble hitting your metrics? Well, I'm having trouble hitting my metrics.
As if you're comparing 40-yard dash times, as if they have anything to do with each other whatsoever, right?
Exactly. What I see as one of the biggest buckets, particularly in the startup community, is when we compare ourselves to other founders. And it's not just founders, right? But it's comparing ourselves to our peers. And I find this to be the most consistently useless exercise that never ends well. You know what I mean?
Anytime we spend scrolling that we could have spent building, like where all we're doing is just trying to gather evidence that we're not doing everything that we could be, guess what? You're making it true by virtue of doing that, right? Put down the Facebook, put down the Instagram version of whoever it is that you're trying to benchmark against, and just get back to building, right? Somebody said it, right? There's a quote out there somewhere, I don't remember who, but the only comparison that matters is who you were yesterday, right? Like, are you better off today? Did you accomplish something today? Did you get something done? The minute we start comparing ourselves to others, and look, you said something about like people comparing themselves to their peers. At least if they're comparing themselves to their peers, maybe there's some overlap or some value. The one that kills me is when they align themselves with someone who has nothing to do with them. They're like, well, look, Microsoft is doing this. And like, do you have any concept? Pre-revenue startup fits in comparison to Microsoft? Not at all, right? You can't even afford their operating system at this point. We don't need to worry about how you compare to them as a business, okay? It's all right. You'll be fine.
You know, something that's really funny about everything we talk about here is that none of it is new. Everything you're dealing with right now has been done 1,000 times before you, which means the answer already exists. You may just not know it, but that's okay. That's kind of what we're here to do. We talk about this stuff on the show, but we actually solve these problems all day long at groups.startups.com. So if any of this sounds familiar, stop guessing about what to do. Let us just give you the answers to the test and be done with it.
I find this a lot because I spend a lot of time with a lot of founders at all stages of their career and all stages of success. But what I find consistent across the entire spectrum is the comparison. Now, here's why that's fascinating. Because let's say that we've got a scale, and I'll make up this scale. Say it starts from 1 and goes to 10. 1 is I'm a broke college student, I'm destitute.
Yeah.
And 10 is I'm a billionaire. As far as, I'm just going to use money for a second as the success metric, just because numeric. The folks at the 1 side and the folks at the 10 side equally spending as much time comparing.
Yeah. Oh, it's
but here's where that's messed up.
It's a great habit. Once you start it, it rarely stops.
But here's what's messed up. The thought was when you were at the 1 level, that once you got to 2, the 1 issues would go away. Like you'd stop doing that.
Yeah.
Certainly once you got to 10, they'd all go away. And what I found was interesting was in every case, whenever people change their peer group, in other words, they level up from 1 to a 2, they just bring the expectations with them. Right?
100%.
They just have a new set of expectations. And I find it fascinating. And I want to share kind of just like a little bit of a personal journey because as I've watched it in myself, right? In my life, like I grew up dirt poor. And so my benchmark, I was a 1. I think I was like a -5, right? I didn't have food. So
you were borrowing the 1 at that point.
I was pretty far back. I look at that and I think to myself, at that time, in the earliest part of like my childhood and certainly in the formative stages of my career, all I cared about was safety, right?
Yeah.
Like I just wanted to get to 1. Like 1 was like amazing. And so when I got there, I was thankful, don't get me wrong, but immediately I was thinking about 2. And once I got to 2, immediately I was thinking about 3.
Oh, yeah.
And I found this behavior where no matter how many times I leveled up, I felt exactly like I did before, only the stats had changed. And for those of you that are video game nerds, you can appreciate this. I play a ton of video games. It's like when you level up, but the people that you're fighting just level up with you, right? It's every Assassin's Creed game ever. And so, yes, you have the +10 sword, but it doesn't matter because now everybody has +10 swords.
Yep.
But when all you had was the wooden dagger, you thought to yourself, if I could just get one day the +10 sword, everything will be solved. And it never is. You can't win the peer comparison game because there's always new peers.
You cannot. No, it's comparison in general. It's a waste of time. And the only way to win that game is not to play it and just build the startup that matters to you, right? Just do the things that matter to you. look, it is so easy to get lost in this, right? Like again, going back to my own history, I remember doing it multiple times simply because I didn't have an answer for something. I didn't have an expectation for how something should go. So the minute I heard one, I just adopted it as my own. I'm like, I'll take care of you forever and you'll take care of me too, right? Turns out no.
Yeah, it was interesting because everybody talks about doom scrolling through social media and stuff like that. And I think social media is dangerous, and I'm not trying to make a point about social media, but I'm saying I'll give you like a personal. I don't spend a ton of time on social media for a bunch of reasons, which is ironic because I'm a super social guy. Part of it is because I don't want to spend time finding out what other people are doing. Like if I have time, I want to go be doing something, but that's not really the issue. The issue is when I scroll through social media, it depresses me. And by the way, I know I'm not the only one. So when I'm saying this, like I'm saying this is like one of the most.
Some books written about this, in fact.
Oh yeah, it's a whole study, right? And so there's whole commissions being formed and have formed around this, targeted at somebody named Zuckerberg. But my point is, as I'm scrolling through, and I'm like, oh, this person's doing better at something, or this person's doing better at something, or this person's doing better at something. I actually have to stop myself and take inventory of my life. Let me give you an example of what that inventory looks like and how hard it is to benchmark against, right? So I have to stop and say, well, you know what? Like, I've had a good life. I've been able to do everything I've ever wanted to do, right? I became a millionaire when I was 22, right? Not a lot of people get to do that. So I've been, fortunate my entire life, my adult life. I have an amazing wife. I have amazing kids. I have a dream job where I get to work with you and people that I really care about. I get to help people all day. But here's my point. This isn't me trying to like brag about my life. Yeah. This is me saying everything's going as well as it possibly could and 1,000x better than I ever expected. And I still have to go through that exercise when I spend time on social media. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, so everything's gone as well as it could possibly go. How's everybody else feeling about this?
Look, any activity I find myself doing where I realize I have to hit pause and do some self-therapy to unwind it, it's like, I probably shouldn't be doing this, right? I need to back off this. Yeah, it's the same boat, man. Like I have not turned the corner on social in the way that a lot of people have. And I think to my benefit, not to my detriment. There were times where I was like, I need to be more active there. And I was like, every time I get more active there, I remember why I'm not. And it goes back to the comparison game. And even if I'm not playing it, I'm watching a bunch of other people do it. And it's just like, it doesn't yield anything of value for me.
It's a bunch of things too. For me, again, this goes back to the, comparing to peers and things like that. Because we work with founders, the stratification of how my peers are doing it goes from 1 to 10, 100x either way, right? Yeah. So everything from this person just lost everything. In that conversation, hang up the phone, pick up the phone, and this person just bought a yacht, right? Like
they just want it all.
Both ends of the spectrum, right? I think for me that helps me because I realize that it kind of doesn't matter where I am personally. There's always going to be another side of that. Yeah. And so my resolution, you kind of came to this before, is I just can't play the game. The only way to win is to not play. Yeah. Only way to win. And nobody's ever won otherwise.
Well, I think this brings us to a great third point here, right? We can talk about the next bucket around how we tie all this to our self-worth, right? You talk about like this comparison that we're doing, and you want to find a way to really call whatever you've actually accomplished into question. Go look what other people are doing, right? And again, like you're comparing based on a few tiny glimpses into what this other person's done. But what really ends up happening here is that we just dial up our insecurities. As if we don't have enough challenge with that as founders, that comparison is part of where the kind of the third bucket generates for me, right? It's rarely comes from anywhere other than comparison, right? And so that the insecurity around what I'm doing, is it good enough? Is it enough? Is it big enough? Is it fast enough? Comes from some absolutely baseless comparison to somebody else who did the thing that I think I should be doing, right? Which drives so much insecurity.
We all fall into the bucket that our success equals our self-worth.
Yeah.
We get to the point where we think, if I could just be more successful, it's going to satisfy these other issues or really insecurities. It always maps back to insecurities. I've seen almost no one ever pull this off, right? Myself included. Whatever insecurities I had 30 years ago are to the letter exactly what they are today.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
which is bizarre to me. Like, I've lived 100 lifetimes. So the amount of experience that I've been able to gather, I don't know, wisdom is the right word, but that's all, where you're looking at things like, okay, now I get it now. while I understand my insecurities better, they haven't changed whatsoever.
Oh, they level up just like anything else does, right? You talk about you got the level 10 sword now. Now you get the level 10 insecurities to go along with it, right?
That's really it.
It
right?
is.
It reminds me of like the guy that rolls up to his yacht or with his yacht into like the marina, and he's got, I'm just making this up, the 50-foot yacht.
Yeah.
And in his marina, he's by far the biggest yacht.
Yeah.
And then he pulls up to this other marina,
Yep.
and he's a dinghy.
Welcome to Monaco,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And whenever I see like those aerial shots of Monaco, and of course that, they're always showing the yachts and stuff, I think to myself, that is a bay of insecurities.
It is.
Right?
Absolutely.
Every single one of those captains, so to speak, those owners are a giant bucket of insecurities that is personified in a single body of water.
Oh, you can actually read a lot about this just from reading the names of the boats, right? You just walk up and down and read. You'll understand exactly what they were trying to overcome with those purchases. But it's funny. I actually had that experience. A guy I know in the Mediterranean, self-made shipping magnate. Like I didn't know you could still do that, but this guy's done this in the last 15 years. Same kind of thing. Like bought this gorgeous boat and was telling me about it and showing me pictures. I was like, wow, it's amazing. It's this, it's that, it's that. He goes, yeah. He's like, but it was only like 5 million, and pretty much all the other boats in the marina are like 15 plus and whatever. And I'm like, God, like you poor bastard. You just spent 5 million to feel worse about yourself. Like it's so sad. So sad.
Where I saw that in spades is in San Francisco.
Yeah.
I have never seen more high achieving, wildly insecure people in my life. Like the concentration of those two things. And again, this is partially a compliment. I've never seen a higher concentration of the smartest, most productive people on the planet. Yeah. Okay. So this is me saying, like, and these are friends of mine. So I'm not disparaging San Francisco. I'm saying I've never seen so many people make so much money and have so much talent and be so insanely insecure about it.
Well, I think it goes back to something, man. Like I think that in those cases, what you tend to see, right? And I've been guilty of it myself. It's that you said it before, right? You got to separate your startup success from your own self-worth. And like you and I talk about this a lot, like being able to celebrate wins and making sure that you celebrate even the little wins because they're all really important. Yes, celebrate the wins, but don't let them define you. Right. Because in almost every one of those cases, these high achieving people who are just really unhappy or really insecure, you can kind of gauge the distance that they are right now from their last win. Right. And in some cases, it doesn't have to be far. They're like, well, yeah, I haven't had a marketing success since yesterday. Success isn't going to fix that. Right. It's not going to fix that level of insecurity because you're just going to keep carrying them forward. You're going to keep leveling up the insecurity and keep raising the benchmark. I mean, like as startup founders and whatever that rung that was out of reach yesterday, the minute we get it in hand and can press up, like we put that thing under our foot as quickly as we can, and that becomes the thing we're pushing off from, right? We don't take time to celebrate it. We don't allow it to kind of like sink in and say like, yeah, I did that thing, right? Even if we do celebrate it, we quickly relegate it to, okay, that's already done that. What's next? What's higher? Where's the next rung?
I kind of hit this moment. You and I've talked about this over the past year when I hit 50, and I said to myself, I'm tired of having goals. Now, for people like us or other founders that are built around goals, saying I'm tired of having goals is the polar opposite of our DNA. But let me explain. Every time I achieved a goal, my life didn't change at all. Now financially something changed, or maybe I had a nicer something. Yep. But I was exactly the same person with just different shit. And I remember years ago, Sarah and I decided to move to Beverly Hills. It wasn't our first choice. We just, as you remember, we just happened to find a house there. But I remember when we got it, I was like, you know what the hell? Like, let's see how the other half lives, right? Or more specifically, let's test this. Let's find out if living like that, we're like living at the top of a mountain, right? With celebrities. We're so out of place. But my point is, I was like, if this is as good as it's supposed to be, as everybody says it is in the brochure, then we'll make it work, I guess. Maybe not. But if it's not, I don't want to spend one more minute thinking about the grass is always greener because I already know it's not. So here's what ends up happening. So we end up moving out there. Our kids start school there. We're kind of, get involved in the community. And we had already lived in LA before, so we had a ton of friends there. My wife and I are at dinner. And I'm like, this is really no different than when we've been at dinner anywhere else. I mean, yes, it's theoretically a nicer restaurant, but we have to spend like $150 to Uber our babysitter to our house.
Yeah.
So she can watch our kids. I was like, there's no way we're getting out of this dinner for less than like $400. And otherwise, we're going to sit at home and just watch Netflix. And it's going to be the most expensive Netflix vis-a-vis like the cost of housing and everything else that we'll ever watch in our lives. I was like, I keep waiting for what's better and I can't seem to find it. And so we left, right? We were just like, we didn't hate it. We thought that success or that milestone or that thing would unlock all this other stuff, right? This other private level of life and happiness and success. And it offered none of it. If anything, it was more stressful.
I was gonna say I can imagine collecting some insecurities while there. That wouldn't have been hard to do.
Oh my God, yeah.
Right? Talk about being right up front against a benchmark that you're unlikely to achieve because you don't want to either, right? Like it's so crazy. But so let's not talk about that. Right. So where this narrative comes from, right? Like this whole thing, like, so you shortcut the process, right? Because you could have said like, okay, I'm gonna spend the next 20 years of my life building the required resources to gather the money, to gather the influence, whatever I need to be able to go there and do this thing. You shortcut the process. And so like, let's just go try it and see if we want it. You got there and you realize you didn't. Unfortunately, there's a narrative in the startup community that's counter to that, which is that like, you got to grow fast, get massive, make billions, right?
Got it.
If you're
no other
riding
option.
a unicorn, it's a donkey, right? Maybe. Like why does it even matter, right? Who decided that that's the only definition of success? And again, like, because if you haven't been there, if you haven't tasted or you don't find a way to test it, you won't know if it's even worth achieving. And what a waste of time, energy, resources, emotions to do that. Because if it doesn't actually align with what you want, then we're just really latching onto somebody else's vision and then trying to achieve it. That sounds really dumb when you say it that way, and yet we see so many people do exactly that. So how do we recalibrate? I mean, your story was perfect. As a startup, what do we do there?
The startup community, unfortunately, we have a lot of broken narratives, but one of them, without question, is you have to be big, you have to be giant, you have to, scale fast, etc. And I always thought to myself, and we've done whole podcasts about this, do you?
Yeah.
For whom? Because we get to see 1 million businesses built 1 million ways, and only a tiny percentage of them require any of that. When I was living in San Francisco, when I was living in Los Angeles, I would have a lot of conversations with founders where they would be talking about how you have to be the biggest, you have to be, crazy growth, whatever. I kept raising my hand and I said, listen, I know I'm the weird counter narrative guy, and I'm not trying to be counter narrative guy. I'm really trying to understand how you got here. I said, but like, I've built businesses that are just as successful in other ways that have nothing to do with anything you just said. And I've met 1 million founders who have done the same, who are just like, I'm just going to start a business. It's going to make money every year. And over a number of years, I'm going to have a lot of money.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah,
right. You weirdo. I think in terms of how easily we get seduced by this startup narrative, we get seduced by this idea that, oh, I guess I have to get 10x bigger in a year. And I'm like, for whom? Right. Well, if I get that much bigger, then there'll be a bigger outcome and I'll have all these things. And I'm like, oh, there it goes. Yeah. Now you're just taking all the buckets we just talked to. How your self-worth will change, how you'll compare to your peers, and how the investors' expectations will set, all of which are bullshit.
All of them are predicated on the biggest word in that whole sentence, Will, which was if, right? If I do those, right? You're going to go,
but even when,
effort, but Ryan, there's still like, it's a long shot, right? Like, so even if you are successful, we're questioning what comes at the end of that. The vast likelihood is you won't succeed with that, right? You don't have to grow like crazy. You know, if you're building something that matters to you, does it really matter how long it takes to get there? Does it matter if you make 1 billion or 500 million or 5 million or 500,000 next year? Probably not that much, right? I really wish we saw more founders stay drunk on the idea of building what matters to them and not what other people expect. And again, like, not even really what other people expect. Collectively, there's this idea of an expectation because there is a collective narrative. But like, nobody really expects you to go do it. In fact, they hope you won't so that they can in most cases, right? It's like they don't expect you to do it. They're like, I hope he doesn't. It'll take my market share.
I think though, the concept of, like you said, I've got to get big, startup community, I'm a startup now, we got whatever. It's just a really unchecked expectation, as all the ones that we're talking about are. It's bizarre to me that you would say I have to grow, blah, 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 without any indication as to why.
Yeah.
So in other words, and we've done whole podcasts on this. In fact, it was one of the first podcasts we ever did, talking about how $250,000 is all the money in the world.
Life-changing amount. Yep.
Right. I remember we got such a strong reaction from that. And it actually, it's funny. I remember sitting across from, I remember Sam Parr.
Yeah.
My first, yeah.
Yep.
So this was when Sam was still doing the hustle. And Sam and I were at dinner. And so a long time ago, Sam was saying he had just listened to the podcast. And he said, hey, man, and I just listened to that episode and I loved it. And I was like, well, what'd you love about it? He's like, well, at this point, I haven't made any money. And he was saying, so yeah, $250K is all the money in the world to me. It was so different for someone to come out and say it. And again, it was cool because I was watching Sam kind of process the bullshit, because he had just moved to San Francisco as well. The bullshit of what that narrative is compared to his own reality, which is like, I'd be good with that.
Yeah, exactly. When you start to actually layer that over your reality and compare that to what would that actually look like if there was $250K in the bank tomorrow that wasn't there today, how much does that change things? All right. And again, like we did an entire episode on this too, optimize for the likelihood of the outcome, not just the size. Because if you go like, well, would it be better if it was $1 billion? Oh, I guess, yeah, that's more than 250,000. So theoretically, yeah, that'd be better. But like, what are the odds of that? Right. And why does that become the low water mark, right? Why do we set these incredibly unrealistic expectations? And again, without measuring them against our reality to say like, would it matter that much? At some point, there is a clear and diminishing return on the additional time, the additional risk, the additional money, the additional energy, the lost life, the lost happiness, the deferred, all of that stuff, relationships. That just isn't worth, right? Without very clearly identifying whether or not that's a good expectation to have in the first place.
I think for every founder, if we're going to go down this road, if we're going to have this journey, and we're going to say, I'm putting everything I have into it, the first thing we have to do is audit our expectations. Yeah. We have to stop and say, you know what? Everything that was an expectation I have up till now of me, by me, whatever, is bullshit.
Yep.
And I'm hitting the reset button. And I'm not going to lift a finger until I've actually figured out what expectations actually do matter to me, where they come from, why they matter to me. And I'm going to calibrate exactly how much effort I need to meet the absolute minimum expectations that I need to get to. And if I need some more expectations later on, I'll get there. But for the time being, I'm going to focus all of my effort, all of my time, all of my energy on meeting the least amount of expectations I need in order to build an amazing startup that works for the only person that matters, and that's me.
Overthinking your startup because you're going it alone? You don't have to, and honestly, you shouldn't, because instead, you can learn directly from peers who've been in your shoes. Connect with bootstrapped founders and the advisors helping them win in the Startups.com community. Check out the Startups.com community at www.startups.com to see if it's for you. Could be just the thing you need. I hope to see you inside.